Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Yoon. I'm a staff attorney here at Coast to Coast Legal Aid of South Florida. Specifically, I'm part of the RISE program here at Coast to Coast Legal Aid South Florida, where I represent victims of domestic violence in criminal court cases. They have some specific rights that belong to them through the Florida Constitution, and that's what I advocate for and protect in terms of my representation. I also represent victims of domestic violence in injunction cases here in Broward County with Coast to Coast Legal Aid of South Florida. Today, I'm so happy to have be part of this panel discussion and help facilitate it. The purpose of our discussion here today is to cover several topics about housing resources and protections for survivors of domestic violence. A very important issue. Obviously, we all know locally here in South Florida, housing crisis, I think is the right way to put it. Rates are going up, rents going up, but there is distinct issues that impact survivors of domestic violence that we're going to cover today. And to help us do that, we have once again, a panel discussion. We have two wonderful guests here that have been so willing to join us and to help facilitate this discussion. I'm going to start with Ms. Shena Kitt. She is the Chief Operating Officer for Women in Distress here locally. If those of you are observing, if you're familiar with the kind of work we do, what Women in Distress does for the county, for survivors of domestic violence and others as well. A very important partner that we have that we work with in helping survivors of domestic violence. So she'll get an opportunity here in just a moment to introduce herself and tell us a little bit of what she does as her role as a Chief Operating Officer and what services and aspects of women in distress provide. Also, we had Ms. Karla Ng. She is the Director on Gender-Based Violence, Prevention, and Equity from the Housing and Urban Development, HUD. We all know HUD through the federal government, and she's joined us to discuss, Ms. Kitt's going to give us a local kind of perspective of the housing issues and survivors of domestic violence. But Ms. Karla Ng is going to give us kind of the bird's eye view from the outside, from the Washington, D.C. perspective, if you want to put it that way, about what provisions and what protections they have through Violence Against Women's Act and how it impacts survivors of domestic violence. So we are so happy to have both of our panel guests here today, and we're going to cover several topics here. Once again, as I just mentioned, the Violence Against Women's Act, any kind of voucher programs that are local for survivors of domestic violence, emergency situations. I'm also going to touch upon one thing that is applicable as well, is in situations where there's protection orders through injunctions and how a use of the home, the marital home maybe, or the residence where the parties had resided, and what the interactions of that and how it impacts the survivor of domestic violence. So I'll touch upon that as well. So before we move any further, I just want to say we want to make this as interactive and as organic as possible as a discussion. We will be monitoring any questions, thoughts, comments about any topics we're discussing or anything else for that matter. Please, I encourage you to chime in. Put your questions, thoughts, or comments in the chat, and I will do my best to kind of keep up. And if I got to stop the discussion and ask the question or express the thoughts. So please, we encourage you to help facilitate this panel discussion on your own with those questions and comments and thoughts. So with that being said, let's start with, as I mentioned, Ms. Shena Kitt. She, once again, is the Chief Operating Officer with Women in Distress. Hi, Shena. How you doing this afternoon?
I am doing well. Thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me here this afternoon to speak with you all. So.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much for taking the time today.
No
so if you would, just briefly, once again, as I kind of hinted at the beginning, tell us your role at Women in Distress and kind of what aspects you kind of oversee as a Chief Operating Officer. And once again, kind of hone in on some of the housing issues that you're dealing with, specifically, obviously, with survivors of domestic violence.
Understood. So here at Women in Distress, like Paul said, I'm the Chief Operating Officer, so I oversee all programs under our purview. So we also have, of course, security on site and IT and all the other things that you are not here to listen to right now, but more specifically programs. So Women in Distress offers a wide variety of programs. The reason we do that is to meet the need of survivors of domestic violence, across the county. One of those programs, or a few of the programs that we have, are geared towards supporting survivors to help them build financial sustainability. And that also includes housing, right? Which is the main reason why we're here today, to talk about, the impact of housing in our community and what are the resources that are available. So underneath that, we have at least about 136 beds here at our location. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because, our center was structured to be a 6-week program initially, right? For individuals to get out of a very dangerous situation, to come in and just begin to start over, right? Because this is just the beginning. What we have found, because of the housing issues that have been
Mhm.
rampant across everywhere in Florida, and more specifically in Broward, is that we're now holding on to survivors much longer than our minimum stay. So we're looking at about a 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 month stay.
Wow.
And in some cases, even longer, just depending on a lot of other variables, right? So if we talked about immigration issues, once you start to stack the issues, the stay becomes a longer situation, right? Now imagine, going out into Broward County, which we are one of the least affordable metro areas, right, in the state,
Yeah,
maybe in the
unfortunately.
nation. Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So now, and that's according even to our own study. So that came from the Broward County Affordable Housing Assessment, and that was done in 2022. And much has not changed since, right? And so now we're saying to survivors, at first you were able to possibly get out and stay and live on your own. You were able to maybe get to safety as a result of
Sure.
COVID and everything after that. Now we're saying, okay, so you can get out, but how long will you be able to stay out? Can you afford to leave your perpetrator? Which is a
Mhm.
horrible question to have to ask yourself. In today's housing market, it is, I stay with my perpetrator who will continue to beat me, or do these mental games and all the other things that come along with power and control, or I can choose to be homeless or go to an emergency shelter. That is a very hard decision to make, right?
Absolutely.
So when we're talking about what are survivors facing when they get into, the housing market and they're just trying to look for things, they can expect to sometimes pay $6,000 to $8,000 just to get into the apartment, right? Or
That's
whatever
just to
home
get
they're
their
trying to
that's
do.
just to get their foot in the door.
Correct. That's just to get their foot in the door.
Okay.
Not to mention the utilities that they now have to place in their
Of
name. So that's
course.
an additional fee, the application fees that are going out. That's just to get in the door. For us, the defining moment on our end was when we actually had to help a survivor get into a place, and we supported her by providing $10,000 just for her to move into an
Wow.
apartment. It wasn't a very large apartment, but there were so many factors in that survivor's life that caused, even from credit to this to that. But then barring that, just the market, that's what the landlord wanted, right? And so now we're in a space where it's like you can be very well approved for an apartment. And if
Mhm.
another person comes in or an applicant comes in, they may offer more money. And then the survivor will lose that place, not because of anything that they did, but simply because they didn't
So
have enough
there's
money and they didn't beat the bid.
so there's almost like a higher, if there's a higher bid for some of these like these locations,
Correct.
and that applicant, that survivor who's trying to relocate, everything may be processing well and they may be qualifying, but boom, someone can kind of jump in there and take that
They can
location.
come in. And we've even had our own employees share the same stories as they look in the housing market. So we're trying to build programs to help combat basically the housing market. We're
Sure.
trying to reach out to different funding sources. We're explaining like, these things are real things. We have real backup to show you like, and the housing market is what it is. But for someone to choose, a very dangerous situation over being able to move out, that is a very serious problem. That is a very serious problem. So,
And as an attorney and once again, I represent victims of domestic violence and criminal cases and also injunctions. I know
mhm,
exactly what you're talking about. I like the word that you use. There's issues stacked right? A lot of times these individuals, you know, we like to call them survivors or trying to help them survive their situations, right?
Exactly.
When they come to WID, Women in Distress, when they come to Coast Legal Aid of South Florida or other organizations, wherever they may be,
Right.
there are stacked issues. It's not just the housing, but like the cost benefit analysis that they have to do is, can I survive on my own, and or am I going to end up homeless?
Exactly.
Or am I going to have to stick with the abuser just to make sure there's food on the table? And also, this always comes up, and maybe women, you can comment on this a little bit. Children are involved. There's always young minor children. No, I shouldn't say always, but more often than not in these situations, there's children involved, and that's such a difficult situation for these individuals that are trying to escape such a horrible situation to deal with. Have you had to deal with, I'm sure you have, I should say, you've had to deal with situations where there's children involved. How has Women in Stress, is that another aspect that they can help in terms of childcare and with the housing and all that stuff? Any comment on that?
Of course. So even going back to when I said we had to build programs to meet the needs of survivors, right? So we are meeting them where they are and what they need. And we know, right, that childcare is an issue. We know that transportation is an issue. All of those factors come in. So for us, what we've built in-house is for childcare, for example, we have our Child Enrichment Center, which is funded by a private donor, and they allow us to have children be dropped in. We're not a daycare center, but it at least allows for some type of childcare so that individuals can get to those important meetings, right? Or court dates. A lot of court dates, right?
When I know about court dates.
Right? Exactly. So you want to remove as many barriers, to bring back that word, as possible. So we do have childcare. We do offer a lot of other things. So for example, I want to bring up the EHV vouchers, or the emergency housing vouchers that, are provided to us by the Broward County Housing Authority. And they're not just provided to us. So the county has actually really done a great job, and I have to say this, in spreading those vouchers throughout the community and building programs to meet the need of the homeless, issue that we have in Broward County, because it's, I can go on and on, but I'm going to stick to DV because there are a lot of other areas that are impacted right now. But they give these vouchers out, and they don't give a lot out at a time. Sometimes they may get 3 or 4, but this is critical. And this is, out of my 20 years, almost 20 years of doing this work, we have never had access to these vouchers in the past. So that actually speaks to, how the market is doing right now, that they are being given out just to ensure that county residents have a safe place to live and to lay their head.
The need is out there. That shows the need is being heard, and that the county is trying to do something about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they have been, again, they've been so supportive, and even through other funding sources, right? The American Rescue Plan, that has been tremendously helpful. So when we talk about other programs we've built, we're now starting to build a work from home space inside of our residential location to help support even survivors who are afraid to even go out into the community because their domestic violence is that bad sometimes. Or maybe this job is just a lot easier to get a remote work from home, job. And then now you're like, I'm in an emergency shelter. How do I figure this out? How do I do this? We want to try to bring in as many options and opportunities for survivors to be financially, sustaining, and build and grow and all of those things as we can. So we offer economic justice. That program centers around resume writing, building, looking for homes. That actually falls under another housing navigation program that we have. Just trying to really bring in the full scope of how can we support you, from our side without, the external connection, just here. How can we support you so that way you can not have to have, I need to go back to him or them or they, right? Because I just cannot financially make it out here. So we want to give them every opportunity to survive as we can, because Broward is also amongst the top, I would say 5 or 6 of the most lethal counties in the state for domestic violence. So we really want to make sure that we're supporting survivors as best we can, because of that factor. We don't want to lose another person to domestic violence. And we want to
Absolutely.
ensure that we have the programs that are in place. And again, through the help of our funders, both private and public, we're able to create that space so that way they can at least have a better start. In a lot of the trainings that I have, I talk to folks and I say, listen, raise your hand if you can give a survivor an apartment right now, or a house, a car, and a job right now today. Can you do that? And in most of those training spaces, the answer is no, right?
Mhm.
Because sometimes it might be a little harder. However, even if you can't give that to them, at least let's work together to provide, support and services. And again, that's what Broward County has really responded to, is trying to ensure that, all of our local organizations and businesses and nonprofit, we're in a place where we can support survivors of domestic violence through all of the barriers that they may have.
It takes a village, right? Sometimes in these situations, it's so nice to hear that at least that these kind of outside resources are coming in a little bit. But I think I can confidently say on behalf of you and those of us who work in this, who are in this field, it's just never enough, though, is it? Right? It's very difficult to make ends meet for a lot of the survivors that come knocking on our doors. I want to segue over to briefly, I saw something pop up here in our chat. I believe it's Karla Ng who provided some information with the Housing, Urban, and Development. There she is. Hi, Karla. Thank you so much again for joining us tonight. You mentioned, Shena, when you were just speaking about immigration issues, that they also kind of show its face too with a lot of these situations. I know immigration obviously is a federal issue. It's not a state issue here. And I've dealt with victims or survivors of domestic violence that had immigration issues. They are held captive by an abuser who has status, yet holds that to manipulate their prey, their victim, using that. And I know that Violence Against Women's Act, that's a federal act here. If you who are listening and observing this panel discussion, the Violence Against Women's Act, otherwise known as VAWA, is a critical resource, a critical act for survivors of domestic violence. And maybe Karla, since that is kind of a federal program, if you want to come and introduce yourself a little bit. And once again, thank you for joining us and kind of talk about the Violence Against Women's Act and how it impacts what victims here, survivors here and on the grounds here in Broward County are dealing with, and all over the country for that matter.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks so much, Paul. And it's good to be here with Shena.
Thank
Such an
you.
honor to be here. I'm Karla Ng. I'm the Director on Gender-Based Violence Prevention and Equity in the Secretary's Office at HUD. I'm a political appointee of the Biden-Harris administration. And so I've been in this role for about 2 years. But previous to this, I worked very closely with folks like you all in legal aid for about 10 years at the National Housing Law Project, providing a lot of training, technical assistance, and support for all the really, really great work that you all do every day on behalf of folks who desperately need your assistance, including survivors. And I just, wanted to give you a little bit of background about sort of the work here as well. As many of you know, gender-based violence prevention is a major priority of this administration. You've probably seen some things in the news, including the recent reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which we finally got done after 9 years. It was long overdue. And so with that reauthorization came some significant new protections that, we will definitely go over today. But I also just want to take a step back to just let you all know also, with the creation of my role, one of my mandates was to create gender-based violence prevention priorities within HUD. Right. HUD, as you know, is an agency that provides a lot of HUD subsidies. It provides a lot of other sort of housing supports and services that are really critical to many people in this country. And they also have done a significant amount of VAWA implementation in terms of implementing the housing protections under VAWA. We've also done some enforcement work, but we've never really kind of done a more comprehensive work around gender-based violence prevention generally. And so with me being here, we really established those priorities, which I'll go over quickly with you all today. But I do want to let you know that we are also establishing a gender-based violence prevention office at HUD that will be permanent. And that's significant, right? Like if you're really trying to institutionalize this work and make sure that there is continuity that matters, we have to get that office going, get it staffed, and have the right people there to do this work because it is so, so, so critical, like Shena and Paul has talked about already. So happy to sort of talk a little bit about, I have slides, and once the slides go up, Paul, just know that I can't see anything. I can hear you. So feel free to at any point, just sort of give me the Apollo cane and like shut me down if you want to, just kind of keep it short.
I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. So let me see if I can get these going. Okay, and then I will try to show my screen here. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, and the
Yep, we're good
slides
to
are,
go.
okay, great. Let's see. Making sure that can, okay, great. Okay, so Shena's already touched on a lot of the challenges that survivors face. Housing is definitely one of them, right? Like getting sort of more nuanced about it. Survivors face a number of barriers related to admissions, evictions. Folks tend to have criminal records, they have bad or no credit history, and other sort of eviction records related to the violence that has happened to them that leads to sort of all these barriers. Evictions, lease violations also result because of things like quote unquote domestic violence that's considered criminal activity or failure to pay rent. Nuisance ordinances, there are lots of them in Florida, right, where folks face penalties potentially if they are calling the police too many times within a given period are incredibly problematic for survivors who need to call emergency assistance and get protection. Emergency transfers or safety moves is another big one for survivors, right? Survivors need to move often. And so there are lots of challenges around that in terms of housing supply and also just landlords and owners not understanding their obligations. When I used to provide technical assistance to legal aid attorneys and other survivor advocates like yourselves, like emergency transfers and evictions were at the top of the list, right? With transfers really being extremely, extremely hard to effectuate, mainly because of the housing supply issue, because once we sort of educated landlords and grantees about it, they're like, okay, we get what we need to do, but we have no stock, right? We don't have any available units that we have, survivors don't feel safe living in. And so we don't have a lot of options here. And of course, the trauma informedness, right? What we hear time and time again from survivors working with housing providers is the folks they're working with don't understand survivors. They don't understand how to talk to survivors who are in crisis. They are assuming that survivors should be acting in certain ways, making certain decisions. There's a lot of victim blaming that happens, which is very frustrating for someone who is already in crisis and desperately needs assistance. And now we're just compounding the ability for them to really get that assistance that they need. Here are some like real life quotes from survivors who are, we're talking about the obstacles that they face. And one said, they went to their local shelter, DV shelter, and they said there were no openings. So they went back to the abuser because they had nowhere else to go. Right. That resonates, that echoes what Shena said earlier, is like there are these impossible decisions that survivors have to make. And then another survivor said that if she didn't have housing supports, that she would lose her child, right, to child services, and they would have to live on the street. And that contributes, right, to the decision to stay, quote unquote, stay with an abuser as if it's an option. But a lot of times it is not. It is the only option that survivors have because they don't want to lose their children. And so here very quickly, I just want to outline our prevention priorities around gender-based violence, just so as an agency, like when we are looking at policies, developing policies, changing policies, looking at funding priorities, that we are always centering these things. So centering the survivors' needs and their experiences is incredibly important. We are being intentional about being trauma informed, and that's no small feat for an agency that has 8,000 staff across the country. We just started, for the first time in our agency's history, we have internal trainings for our staff to get them to start learning about how to work with survivors, being more trauma informed. It's not a one and done deal, right? Like it takes a long time to really build that skill and build that muscle, but we're starting it for the first time. Really focusing on historically marginalized, quote unquote, or underserved populations, right? So survivors of color, survivors experiencing disabilities, LGBTQI+ survivors, immigrant survivors, like we've mentioned. We're also centering their experiences, because once you serve the folks who are truly, truly in need, everyone else benefits from that experience, right? The hard to serve folks, so the folks who have backgrounds that can be problematic for people accessing housing, we're also focusing on those. Intersectionality is obviously key because survivors are not a monolith, right? we're all very complicated and layered people and informed by our background and all the things we've experienced in life. So making sure that we're always being flexible and nimble is also important. Creating a feedback loop. We are really trying to be intentional to make sure that everything we're doing is being formed by what is actually happening on the ground. That hasn't been always true of everything we've done at HUD, but with the gender-based violence work, it is incredibly important. We have to be responsive to the actual needs of survivors and those working with them, like folks like yourself. So, please be on the lookout. We've had some listening sessions already and roundtables with stakeholders, housing providers, as well as survivor advocates, but please be on the lookout for more because we really, really want to hear from you all. Data is really important. When I got to HUD, I realized for the first time that we don't actually have a lot of data on survivors and their experiences with housing instability and homelessness. I think there were 2 data points that I found, and they were both about 15 or 20 years old each.
Wow.
And so it was really dated. We are in the process of working with other agencies like the CDC and Census to get additional data. We're doing I'm not a data person, but what I've been told is by our data people is like they are layering our administrative data on top of other existing data sources so that we can try to find more information about what is going on with survivors, what are their housing needs, and from that information, what makes sense in terms of us developing programs, developing policies to, again, be responsive to their needs.
Karla, can I ask you a quick question about the previous slide? I thought this was pretty interesting, and I agree. A lot of times for obviously organizations, whether on the local or state or federal level, to best serve these individuals who are seeking, specifically we're talking about survivors here, the feedback loop. In order for us to best serve, we need to know what it is they're running into. We have general ideas that we've been discussing, but sometimes there's specific things here and there. So when you say create a feedback loop, what are you envisioning? Let's start from the local level, then to this, from the county to the state and so on, and then all the way up to HUD. Has there been an established kind of chain of command, so to speak, that can get that feedback to the right people? Is this in the works here? And just curious about that. As you mentioned, creating that feedback loop, I think that would be so helpful in addressing these specific from so many different walks of life. Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so far it really has been, myself through my office, making sure that that is happening right now. Like, for example, as part of our VAWA rulemaking that we are undergoing right now, we have had at least two listening sessions, consultation sessions with the public to kind of get a sense of what are you seeing? What are you thinking in terms of what HUD should be doing in terms of VAWA implementation? What have we done? Okay, what could we improve on? We are also we have a human trafficking study, a study that actually VAWA, the last reauthorization, required us to do to really capture the housing needs and services needs of trafficking survivors, both labor and sex trafficking. And so through that, we actually created 2 different groups, one with direct service providers and one with survivors themselves. We're actually paying survivors to be part of these roundtables, and they've been part of this whole process with the study that Congress gave us 10 months. We had like 10 months to do this study. And we've met with the survivors 3 or 4 times to make sure that like their input is being considered. But, going back to this establishing of the office, that's why that office is so critical in part, right? Is like, that is going to be the key to really institutionalizing the things that we've gotten started already. But once we have that office in place, right, there'll be staff whose job it is really to make sure that this feedback loop is ongoing. What I envision is that we would have regular meetings, right? That would be public engagement type meetings, where like quarterly or something, like on some kind of cadence, we would be essentially opening it up to the public and we would be having these kinds of conversations.
I see. Thank you so much. Just curious about these. That's such an interesting thing to kind of have a vision for, and that really gives an opportunity to have some hands-on assessment of what's going on at the local level, federal level, and everything in between. So thank you for that.
So important. It's so important. Continuing on with the priorities, VAWA implementation with the housing protections is obviously a big one, and we'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of the actual provisions. making sure that survivors can actually access our resources. One of the major things that I learned, I realized this when I was an advocate as well, but when I came inside, even though I had done over 10 years of advocacy work with HUD, I didn't realize how many resources HUD had beyond public housing, Section 8, right, which is the typical stuff that we know about, but we do tons of affordable housing, tons of affordable home ownership assistance. We do housing counseling, right? So for folks that are looking sort of more long-term and thinking like, maybe one day I'd like to own a house, right? What does that look like? And so we have resources to help people plan, financially plan, right? Look at their credit, make their credit better, to sort of think more about sort of asset building and credit building. And so sharing resources like that has been one of my major goals. And I've done a lot of presentations where, you know, I basically do a breakdown of like, here's HUD, here's HUD, each office, what we do, and people tend to be more familiar with public and Indian housing. Maybe then they're familiar with multifamily housing, but then as we sort of get into the community planning and development programs, people's, you know, sort of they have hazier knowledge about sort of what we do, but we do a ton of stuff within like the Federal Housing Administration with affordable mortgages and sort of other kinds of things. And so really bringing that to light has been important. And then that dovetails into the final point about economic stability, right? Because a lot of times when you talk to survivors, once they have gone beyond sort of the crisis intervention phase, right? The crises and like immediate shelter and like maybe they even have rental assistance that they do have desires to think beyond that, right? Like maybe one day I do want to own a home. And if that is something that I want to do, what does that look like? I want to start saving. I'm not sure how to do that. You know, I have this job, or like, I'd like to get a job, right? And what does that look like? And HUD actually does do some stuff around job training and job services.
Oh, they do. Okay.
Yeah. So we have all kinds of partnerships with the, you know, other agencies that provide services. And so, you know, we also have like our Section 3 program, you know, that's really for HUD households and making sure that we're prioritizing HUD households in terms of the contracts that we have. So all kinds of things that, again, knowledge is power, right? The more you share this information, people know, and, you know, hopefully they will take advantage of them. So before we delve into sort of the Violence Against Women Act, just generally speaking, there are other laws that also provide housing protections for survivors. So we have like the Federal Fair Housing Act, there are a bunch of state and local laws. So in Florida, you all actually have quite a few laws that are very great for survivors. I think you all have like an early lease termination law and things like that. And so just kind of noting that as we kind of talk about the Violence Against Women Act, because these laws do work together, right? They're interwoven. And so in any given situation, any of these laws could really provide protections for survivors. And so here we are in the Housing Protections for the Violence Against Women Act, which was reauthorized last year. Very generally, the federal law provides housing protections for domestic violence survivors, survivors of sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. Now, this law, most of its provisions only apply in situations where a survivor is applying for or living in federally assisted housing. For most of the protections, if you're run-of-the-mill sort of like private market units are not going to have any kind of VAWA coverage unless there's some kind of federal subsidy at play, like a housing choice voucher, right? Like the Section 8 housing choice voucher, then VAWA protections would apply. And the law, and this is very confusing for people, and I want to just make clear, even though it's called the Violence Against Women Act, it's a very dated title or name. It applies to survivors regardless of their gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. So folks who identify as being male, folks who identify as being transgender, it doesn't matter. If you're a survivor, you can receive protections and remedies under Violence Against Women Act.
I just want to say thank you for clarifying that too. I know I've had many clients that I've dealt with, and I have male clients as well that are survivors of domestic violence. And they run into these situations, and I explained to them, you know, there's this thing called the Violence Against Women's Act. And they, of course, they immediately think, well, I probably won't qualify. I say, actually, you do. So thank you for clarifying that, because that's important. Like, as you stated earlier, so many different walks of life, so many different individuals with backgrounds that are survivors of DV. So thank you for that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And again, like market rate rental housing, unless there's some kind of federal subsidy, VAWA protections are not going to apply. And so what are these federal programs that are covered by VAWA? Here are all the HUD programs. They're also the low-income housing tax credit program from Treasury is covered. The rural development vouchers, as well as the multifamily programs, are covered. So like for those who are working in rural housing, like the farm worker housing units, I believe like one of the home guaranteed home loan program is also covered. OVW's transitional housing assistance grants also covered. There's also a couple of housing and homelessness VA programs that are covered. The ones that are highlighted in red are new as of the 2022 reauthorization. And I say new only in the sense that it's new to the statute. For HUD, we actually covered the Housing Trust Fund program prior to the last reauthorization. So as part of the 2013 reauthorization, but the 202 direct loan program is new for us. But I think there are only a couple of those units in the market anyway. There aren't that many. And so here's a snapshot of some of the major housing rights or protections that survivors have under VAWA. So they cannot be denied admission or be evicted or have their assistance terminated because of the covered violence that's happened against them. There's a right to strict confidentiality of their information, right? For those of us who work with survivors, confidentiality is really the most important thing for survivors, right? That really preempts actually even having safe housing. You know, lots of us have spoken to survivors that are willing to live wherever, so long as their perpetrator doesn't know where they are, that their information is safeguarded, et cetera, et cetera. So really, really important. They have the right to request that a perpetrator be removed from the lease or the unit. So for survivors who feel safe to remain in their units, and they want to get what's called typically a lease bifurcation, although it could be called other things. They want to get their lease bifurcated so that the abuser is off of the lease. They can request that from the housing provider, and it's up to the provider to decide whether or not to provide that lease bifurcation, but it's something that a survivor can request. They have a right to a notice of VAWA housing rights and a self-certification form, and that happens at certain junctures. It has to happen when they get admitted to a program, if they get denied from a program, also if they receive a notice of an eviction or termination. They have to get it at those junctures. A provider, housing provider, can choose to provide that notice and self-certification at points beyond those junctures, but in terms of what the law requires, that's the minimums at those 3 junctures. They can request a safety move or an emergency transfer. And like I mentioned in the beginning, this is by far one of the top problems that we see in terms of implementing VAWA is really effectuating these transfers. For the most part, what I've seen is that it is a supply issue. It's just very difficult to find where to move people when the stock is so low, or maybe there's no stock at all. But in conjunction with that, I also see just a major issue with just landlords knowing that they have these obligations. Often what I hear is that they deny that VAWA is a thing. Like I've heard housing providers say, like, Violence Against Women Act, I've never heard of it. I don't think it exists. And so you have to show them, no, it is. Here's some information. I would say that the easiest way to kind of get you there is advocates with housing providers, and also for housing providers to be more educated on this. To go to our VAWA website, which is new. It's at hud.gov/VAWA, VAWA. And once folks see that, they know, right, HUD has said there are these obligations. There's a FAQ section for anyone to just kind of quickly digest what VAWA is, what the requirements are. And then there's all kinds of helpful TA resources like trainings, fact sheets, and things like that. For survivors that have vouchers that move with the survivor, they can move with that assistance if they need an emergency transfer or safety move. They do not lose the assistance just because they have experienced the violence. So really, really important, and really important for housing providers to know that too, because again, sometimes with just not knowing, they think that they can just take away the assistance from the survivor, and that's not the case. Survivors also trying to get VAWA protections cannot be retaliated against by housing providers, right? So like someone who's trying to get emergency transfer, they cannot potentially be penalized for doing that by potentially threatening an eviction or anything like that. And then there's also the right to call 911 or seek other emergency services without penalty. That actually applies to everyone and includes survivors.
Can I ask a couple questions regarding the previous line? The request for an emergency transfer, what's kind of the scenario that would fall into? Are we discussing if a survivor has been placed in a home with these protections? Let's say, are you trying to say, like, if let's say the abuser was able to locate them again, is that the scenario of an emergency transfer? Am I way off there?
There are different kinds of scenarios. So there's definitely one scenario, which you're talking about, Paul, where the survivor may be the head of household, say they have a voucher, right? Or they're in public housing, and they are living on their own. Maybe there's some children there, and the abuser or perpetrator has found out where they are, and so the survivor no longer feels safe, and so they need to move to another unit. If they have a voucher, they should be able to take that voucher and port or go somewhere else to a safe unit, and they need to work with the housing authority to do that, and they have to work with the landlord to end their lease, right? And so, and those are two different things, right? If we did sort of like a 201 on VAWA, I'd kind of explain situations where VAWA protects the survivor in terms of keeping the voucher. There's nothing explicit about ending the lease early without penalty, right? That's where you have to go to stay in local law to really fill in that gap, because VAWA doesn't speak to that. There's another scenario where, like, they're living together, right? Like the perpetrator, like the head of household might be the abuser. Often is the case if they're together, that the head of household is the abuser. The survivor is living there. And maybe there's like a lease bifurcation, right? There's a lease bifurcation and the perpetrator wants to be kicked out, and then the survivor wants to transfer. Or maybe there hasn't been a lease bifurcation, but the landlord knows, because the survivor has told them there's been this violence or abuse in the household and I need to get out. And so there's a complicated situation now, right? Because say the abuser is still on the lease, what do you do? Many providers will go ahead and do a lease bifurcation in that situation, right? Because they're really worried about the safety of the household and they want to make sure that everyone is safe. And so they will kick the abuser out, and then the survivor needs a transfer because obviously the abuser knows where they're living, right? And so they need to move to another unit. And we have to figure out a way where the survivor and their family, they're not losing the assistance because of that transfer request.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, and here's some additional provisions that are not substantive rights, but still equally important because they're requiring certain things for agencies to do. So, I talked about the right to report, and that includes with it participating jurisdictions that receive CDBG grants or community development block grants. They have to certify and report that if there are certain problematic laws and policies, so like nuisance laws and policies, they would have the obligation to report those to HUD on a regular basis. They also have to certify compliance or not. We also have new enforcement authorities. So for folks who have had experience with VAWA enforcement, we actually have direct enforcement now, whereas before we had to use the Fair Housing Act to get that kind of enforcement power for VAWA violations. The federal agencies, including HUD, also we have to establish VAWA compliance review processes, and that's brand new. We've not had that kind of requirement, so we're in the process of working through that as part of our rulemaking. There's a new definition for homeless under the McKinney-Vento Act that applies to survivors. And so for those who are more familiar, it's the Category 4 homeless definition under McKinney-Vento. And so there's been a big revision of that definition. I've mentioned the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Office before. So that is a requirement under VAWA 2022. And it also includes a requirement to establish the VAWA director position at HUD. So in addition to the office, there has to be a VAWA director in there. And then there's this trafficking study that I mentioned that we are in the process of finishing up. Actually, it should be ready later on this year and available to the public early next year. And then also providing funding for VAWA training and technical assistance. This is unprecedented. We got $10 million from Congress for fiscal year 22 and 23, which we just awarded out to VAWA TA providers. And that is going to be available to grantees. So like landlords, owners, housing authorities, continuums of care, everyone that is covered by VAWA, to really get intense and comprehensive training and education about VAWA.
That's
and that
great.
Is incredible. And all of these things will also be available to other stakeholders, because it's not just our grantees that need this, right? There are other folks that are also working with survivors who need this assistance. So that will also be available soon.
Carlo, we
Mhm.
have our first question. Here we
Sure.
go, a question here. So Naomi asked, can they use these vouchers? So we've been on the topic, as I asked earlier, about those emergency transfers, things like that, based on these vouchers. Can they use these vouchers to transfer to another state in that emergency situation? I'm thinking, because if it's a HUD, that's kind of the federal agency, is that permitted between states?
Absolutely, yes. So if a survivor has a Section 8 housing choice voucher already and they need to move for safety reasons under VAWA, they can absolutely port that voucher to a jurisdiction outside of their current housing authority. So
Okay.
we have seen ports from California to Boston. That's totally fine. Now,
Okay.
it gets more complicated because it is a port. So like the receiving housing authority, they have to agree to absorb it and all of that. So there has to be coordination there.
Mhm.
So I'm not saying it's easy, but it definitely can happen and has happened.
Great, thank you. Mhm.
Yeah, and so in closing, I just wanted to provide some resources. This is the VAWA website. So again, for like folks who are in the community that are housing providers, this is where you would find the resources. If folks, advocating for survivors, this is also where you'd find the resources. But I think anytime you can point to a HUD website, it really helps with advocacy when you're working with survivors and other folks. For folks wanting more information about how to file complaints related to VAWA violations, our Fair Housing Division is taking complaints. So this is the website you would go to file that complaint at FHEO with FHEO, the Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Office. And then I just wanted to let you know, the National Fair Housing Alliance, every year they do this report where basically they're keeping track of the trends in terms of the complaints, fair housing complaints, that not only that HUD is getting, but also here you see like DOJ gets, our different grantees that do enforcement, like our FIPS and FAPS, our Fair Housing Assistant programs. And so what they found was that in the last year, in 2022, they got a spike, right? They got a spike in domestic violence complaints where they got 289, whereas before they got 172. And whereas these numbers are grim, and it's not good news, obviously, that the fact that we even have to have these kinds of complaints, that's happening. I think what this is also showing is that the word is getting out, right? That our education outreach efforts are working, that people are realizing, oh, okay, HUD is taking these complaints and this is what it's for. And I think that in some sense is good in that people are getting that education. And I would assume actually that this number will increase every year because of the outreach efforts that we've been doing.
And in turn, you could think that will only help the services rendered get better to, like, this is kind of that feedback loop in a sense where you're going to get these complaints and that, okay, we need to work on this as part of this organization and so on. So that could be beneficial in the long run for sure. So yeah, it's kind of you don't want these complaints, but at the same time, it'll give an opportunity to address and provide better services, right?
It's a double-edged sword. And I think one thing that's interesting, we recently had, and I'll put in a couple of press releases that we had. Actually, the Secretary Fudge put out a statement yesterday to commemorate Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is October. But in one of the press releases, we highlight the first two settlements that we've had under the new VAWA enforcement authorities that we have. And one of them is actually with the home recipient, which hadn't happened before. And home, I think, is generally a program that folks know less about because even though there is a rental assistance component, most of the home program has nothing to do with rental assistance, right? It's like money for developing infrastructure, building things. But I think the fact that we're sort of talking now about providers that maybe we would not have talked about in the recent past, I think that also means word is getting out. So I think that's good too.
And this is going to be one of those times, Carla, when I'm going to have to kind of point to you and say, we got about 10, maybe 13 minutes left of our time here. And if you have a few more slides, have at it here, but we're going to try to transition over to some of the one last remaining topic as well, where I can get your input too.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can share these slides. Let's go ahead and end now. This is just about what HUD has done over the last 2 years, but folks can read that themselves. And if they have questions, they can ask me.
And once again, I believe, and we're thank you for doing this at the beginning, where you put in your chat the I believe, the link to the website that you were discussing. So if anybody who's listening and watching wants to get some additional information, I'm sure it's all there on that website that you provided. So thank you for that, Karla. I'm going to take this opportunity, and please, Shena, Karla, chime in here. We're going to present something here. I don't, those of you who are watching, if you can take a look here, this is kind of like Shena focused on kind of the local level with women in distress and some of the issues they run into, and we'll continue to discuss that with the remaining time that we have. We've had kind of the bird's eye view, as I mentioned earlier, with Karla Ng, and how the Housing and Urban Development have their have protections for survivors of domestic violence from all walks of life. And now we're going to kind of come back to kind of the local level here, some of this issue that's applicable through injunction cases. As I mentioned before, restraining orders are critical. I'm sure Shena and Karla can attest to this. When the survivor's trying to get away from the abuser, one of the first steps, especially law enforcement, I deal with victims of domestic violence in criminal court cases. One of the first things that law enforcement does in these situations, whether there's an arrest or not, is tell the survivor, hey, look, go get a restraining order, go get an injunction. They're one and the same, restraining order, injunction. And a lot of our clients that we represent are referred to us in order to get these injunctions. One of the things that comes up very almost, I mean, I guess I can't say 100% of the time, but 99% of the time is as you can see here on your screen, section 4, the temporary exclusive use, possession of the home. Obviously, in domestic situations here, we're talking about a single dwelling, whether there's children or other people involved. It's the two parties are in the home. Well, when a survivor goes to file a petition in these situations, they have the opportunity on this in their application for the restraining order to address their housing situation. I'm going to tell you right now, through my experience, and maybe Shena and Karla can comment on this as well, it's a catch-22, and here's why. It really is a double-edged sword. Here's the situation. A survivor is trying to survive. They call law enforcement, they put the restraining order against their abuser. The temporary restraining order is granted by the court. And then the abuser is ordered, whether through the restraining order, the temporary restraining order that's in place, or maybe a criminal court order that's in place, that they have to be removed from the home. Well, that is gives some sense of relief to the survivor, because they won't be displaced. And that's kind of the one of the main topics we're talking about here. Shena from Women in Distress, a shelter, Karla with HUD and how the protections they have for affordable housing and things of that nature. It's where can the survivor go to get away from the abuser? The first step, that the opportunity to do so, is through this restraining order. They can apply to have the exclusive and use and possession of the home. That feels good. You hear that, okay, great. The survivor can get the home, but that's not how it feels to them more often than not. Some of the things that come up, and some of a lot of my clients that I've represented, issues that come up is, okay, I've got the home, but what's next? They're always worried about what's next. For example, more often than not, the survivors that come to us, they've been financially cut off by their abuser. They have no work, no savings, no money, nothing at all. Sometimes no car, nothing at all. They've been living off the abuser's income. Number two, they've been cut off from all family and friends. They can't call them. They can't go over there. They haven't seen their sisters or brothers in so many years and whatnot. That's one of the things that abusers do, is cut them off so that the survivor can only rely on the abuser. Why do I mention this? Because at some point, that survivor who's at the home can't stay there. Who's going to pay the rent? They don't have money. They don't work. Who's going to put food on the table? No money, no work. And at some point, believe it or not, those of you who are not in this field of work, the abusers, their names are on the utilities and the cable and everything. They'll cut off all these utilities and resources in the home. They'll cut off the light. They'll cut off the water. This is the game they play to keep a survivor with them, so they can't leave them. So those are the issues that come up. That's why it's a catch-22. It's great that the court may give the survivor the home, but for how long? It may be for days or weeks. And after that, without the financial support and income from anywhere else, they are stuck. And that's when, with often comes into play. That's where referrals are made, and that's why Women in Distress is such a great partner. And I'm sure all over the country there are shelters specifically for survivors of domestic violence where they work together to alleviate these situations. There's even situations where, believe it or not, the abuser has home surveillance cameras set up, so they can even watch the survivor and the children at home, talk to them. I specifically have a case recently where the abuser, living out of state, believe it or not, living out of state, somehow hacked into the Alexa and was speaking through the Alexa to the survivor. So you may have the home for a certain period of time, but what's next? And those are the issues, and that's what that come up, and that's why we're talking about this, and that's why we're trying to get resources and funding for these situations, vouchers. Shena, you had mentioned the emergency, what was it, the EV something vouchers? I'm sorry, I'm butchering it right now.
No, it's okay. So there are EHV, and then there's also the housing choice vouchers. I heard Karla also like name out another voucher as well. But yes, those are one of the ways that we can support too. So
right. So just as a panel discussion here, these are the issues we want to bring to light, the issues that these survivors in our communities and local, obviously, and nationally are dealing with. It's very difficult. It's a catch-22 more often than not. There is temporary relief, but oftentimes when they come knocking on doors for services, they need immediate and long-term relief. That's what they need, because there's no way often for them to be removed from their horrific situation without the support of others, the community, women in distress, housing and urban development. And it's great that we have these organizations. I'm so proud to work for Coast to Coast Legal Aid of South Florida and all of my colleagues here, where we do our best with what we have to help these survivors, and really to at the end, that they can identify as a survivor and not a victim anymore. That's a lot of the goals that we have set before us. And that's why we wanted to bring these, have this panel discussion, educate those of you who are watching, who are interested to know about this and how to deal with this. I want to say, of course, at this time, if you know of anybody that is dealing with this situation, one thing that Karla mentioned, I'm sure Shena can attest to this, confidential information, everything remains confidential. It's critical. Like Karla mentioned when she was presenting, it's one of the most important rights that victims have, that survivors have. Under Marshall's law in Florida, there's a right to confidentiality information, specifically, as Karla mentioned earlier, so that when they relocate, the abuser can't find them, things of that nature, protections. So if you know of anybody that may be dealing with this situation, please call our office at Coast to Coast Legal Aid of South Florida. That's what we're here for. And then certainly we have great partners at the local level with Women in Distress, great partners at the federal level with the Housing Urban Development. And we're so happy to have had this discussion. Please reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, if you know anybody who's dealing with this situation. And those of you who are observing, who are attorneys, I'm sure if you didn't know already, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, and I apologize if I didn't. There is a CLE for this, and I'm going to pull it up here for, there's a CLE here. Let me see if I can pull up the number. I know I have it somewhere. I'm not going to let you go without it, everyone. Here we go. Here's a CLE number for today's panel discussion regarding housing development and the cross-section with survivors of domestic violence. It is if you want to write it down, and I'll try to put this in the chat as well. It's 2309208, N as in Nancy. And let's see if I can do that for y'all real quick. 2309208, N. Did I get that right? I hope so. That's the CLE credit here. But once again, okay, I did get it right. Thank you for the feedback there. I want to thank Karla and Shena so much for taking the time to do this this Friday afternoon, to join our panel discussion in such an important topic. And I hope this was helpful for those of you who are watching and who may watch this later. If you know, once again, a survivor that needs some assistance, a lot of information from the discussion here. So once again, thank you, Karla. Thank you, Shena, for spending your time with us here today. Thank you all out there who watched and chimed in as well. We appreciate it. And once again, my name is Paul Yoon with Coast to Coast Legal Aid of South Florida. And I'm going to sign off here. Thank you, everyone, again. Appreciate y'all's time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.